Welcome to this webinar on COP28, what's at stake, and we will also discuss some perspectives of the key players. This webinar is organized by the Global Politics Program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And my name is Gunilla Rachel. I'm head of the program and senior research fellow at the Institute. And we will, as I said, we will discuss COP28 starting next week with the delegates and observers arriving in Dubai for the UN's yearly or annual climate summit. And this will be the scene for competing agendas and also the hopefully ambition raising talks. And this summit, it marks 8 years since countries landed the Paris Agreement, which sets the targets for curbing global warming. Unfortunately, little progress has been made on slashing the emissions on a necessary level. So ambition is crucial here. The last week, UNEP, the UN's environmental program, published its emission gap report, and it shows that the planet is on track for 3-degree warming, and ambition needs to step up. At the same time, the window for this ambition raising is narrowing, so time is of essence as well. Also, this summit takes place against a quite difficult political context. We have war and fights over money, political headaches in some of the most important countries. Also, we see a certain backlash against climate policy in some countries. So this meeting will be of utmost important for, as I said, the central raising ambition, but also to instill the urgency and hopefully hope as well for these talks. To discuss this, I have an excellent panel with me here today, and doing it alphabetically, I have Niklas Bremberg, Associate Professor at Stockholm University and Senior Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I also have online Karoliina Hurri, Postdoctoral Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And also joining online from India, we have Dhanasree Jayaram, Assistant Professor at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Welcome to you as well. And here back to the studio, we also have Naghmeh Nasiritousi, Associate Professor, Uppsala University, and Senior Research Fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And last but not least, we have Professor Stacy VanDeveer, Professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and also visiting professor at the Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala University. So welcome to you. We will discuss this in block. So we will start with Naghmeh and then move to Dhanasree, then Karoliina, and then back to the studio to Stacy, and then to Niklas. After that, we will have time for questions, and you could send in your questions to the Q&A sessions here at the webinar or at Facebook if you follow us there. So, Naghmeh, let's start with the context and some of the issues of the COP28. What would you say are the most important or the key issues at this year's COP?
So COP28 has a packed agenda. It's been described as a moment of truth. And to explain that, I will just provide a context for some of the viewers who might not be too familiar with COPs. So COP stands for Conference of Parties, and they gather nearly 200 countries to come and negotiate on how to address climate change. And decision-making is through consensus, so all countries need to agree. And this, of course, makes it very difficult because there are very interests and various capacities. But in 2015, they did agree on the Paris Agreement, which sets different targets. So the temperature targets to not raise global temperatures too much, so well below 2 degrees or aspiring to 1.5 degree. And the way to do this is that countries submit nationally determined contributions, so they themselves decide how much to contribute to this global work. So COP28 has been called the most important COP since the Paris Agreement, and there are different reasons for this. As you mentioned, we have many gaps to bridge to reach the Paris Agreement's goals on mitigation, how to reduce emissions in line with what the science says, on adaptation, how to help countries become more resilient to the effects of climate change, on finance, how to direct finance from what's dirty to what's clean, and also help countries achieve just transitions. So the absolute key issue at this COP is the global stocktake, and this is a tool that was decided on in the Paris Agreement to review the global efforts to addressing climate change. And what's hoped at this COP is that there will be political signals on the way forward so that there can be a course correction. We know that we're not on track, and discussions will be very intense on how to achieve this. Then there's the issue of loss and damage fund. So we know that countries cannot adapt to all consequences of climate change, and quite vulnerable countries are suffering today and are becoming indebted when there are these extreme weather events. And so how to set up this fund and who will get money from it and who has to pay into it will be key decisions. There's also hope that there can be a decision on adopting a global framework for the global goal on adaptation to help countries measure how to achieve better resilience. And perhaps there will also be a finalization of rules on how countries can use carbon markets to reduce their emissions. And here there will be difficult negotiations on ensuring transparent and stringent rules to ensure environmental integrity. So a very packed agenda.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. But would you say that, I mean, negotiations has already happened over the year on global stocktake and also the loss and damage. Where are we now in those negotiations?
Yes, so on global stocktake, it's to be held every 5 years, and it's to inform the next round of NDCs. And to help countries assess where we are, there has been a technical report issued where we have seen that we are not on track, but they have also suggested ways to address this. So some solutions have been proposed, but then there has also been a synthesis report issued, which has gathered the views of countries and also observers on how this declaration or this decision on the global stocktake should look. And here there are very different interests on the way forward. So this will be negotiated. So the final outcome of the global stocktake must work towards greater international climate cooperation, but also how to strengthen national climate work. When we look at loss and damage, COP27 decided to set up this fund to address loss and damage. And this was a hard fight, decades of pleas by developing countries that there's a need for this fund. So they set up a transitional committee to draw up a proposal to how to set up this fund. And there are different views. So developing countries are arguing that it should not be based at the US-dominated World Bank. And they're also arguing that it should be open for finance to a broad set of developing countries. Developed countries, on the other hand, are focused on the sources of finance, that it should not just be public money from developed countries, but that it should also be financed from the private sector and more innovative forms of finance. And also that rich developing countries that have the means can also pay into this fund. So the current proposal that was agreed a few weeks back argues that, or suggests that the new fund should be housed at the World Bank at least for 4 years, so an interim decision. But neither developed countries nor anyone else would be obliged to pay into the fund. It has language about urging and encouraging, so there are no obligations. So this proposal will now form the basis of a final decision by leaders at COP28. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yes, indeed. I think, all these issues are obviously difficult, but is it possible to single out some sort of package that would be more difficult or more sort of crunch in the negotiations?
Yeah, so at least 4, I would say. The first one is on the political signals that the global stocktake will send. So many countries actually seem to be on board on the idea that the decision should include some kind of targets for renewable energy, but also energy efficiency. But there's less agreement on what to do with fossil fuels. So it's all very well to increase clean energy, but we have had several reports that say we also have to phase out fossil fuels that lead to emissions. The terminology here will be very important. Phasing out is different than phasing down. And we had this fight at COP26 when it was about coal, and we're expecting similar fight. And then a different terminology is about abated or unabated. So the use of carbon capture and storage technology, for example. Some countries have argued that it's not the fossil fuels that are the problem, it's the emissions. So they want the term unabated in there, but we'll see what happens there. On loss and damage, as I said, there was a draft proposal, but no country was particularly happy with this proposal because it's very based on compromises. But it was taken by consensus, although there was a last-minute objection from the United States that had a problem with some of the wordings. So we'll see if there will be an opening up of this proposal at the COP. On Article 6, which deals with carbon markets, the sticking points for the negotiations are likely to be guidelines for authorizing credits, ensuring transparent reporting on traded credits, but also how to prevent double counting and how to define removals, which are key issues to ensure environmental integrity. And finally, on finance, how to change finance flows from dirty to clean, but also how to support developing countries to achieve a just transition.
Very good summarization, thank you. We will turn to the landscape of the key actors in a minute, but before that, there's been some discussion and some controversies about the United Arab Emirates hosting or leading the negotiations, since it's an oil-producing countries. Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you followed that discussion?
Yes, so the COPs are, they move around based on a regional rotation. And so this time it'll be in the Middle East, led by the UAE. And the president, the COP president, is the head of their national oil company, which is very controversial. According to sources, he's not even taking time off for the COP to do this. So there has been strong criticism. The fact that countries themselves decide where it's hosted means that there are some diplomatic rules that say that it's okay. But from a legitimacy point of view, this can be questioned quite a lot on the conflict of interest in this case.
Absolutely. I also would like to ask you if you have any thoughts on, leadership will be crucial, obviously. Do you have any thoughts on what actor who could take that leadership role in these negotiations?
Yes, so of course it depends on the definition of leadership, but it was encouraging to see the US-China Sunnyland statement on enhancing cooperation on how to address the climate crisis. That statement falls short on commitments, but it's an important signal that these two superpowers are talking to each other and want to cooperate on this issue. And it could be mentioned that China has, in fact, achieved some of its promised climate targets ahead of schedule. So they have a tendency to underpromise and overachieve. So there is hope that in the next round of NDCs, they might raise ambition further. But also leadership in terms of how countries will come forward to pay into this loss and damage fund. That will be important. And also many cities, regions, and companies will be there. And some of them have set much more ambitious targets than the national level. And this year at the COP, they will host the first COP-hosted local climate action summit to bring in these local leaders and talk about how the multi-level governance can work better. So that'll be interesting.
Yeah, really. Thank you so much for this excellent start of the panel. I think it really lays the foundation for the coming discussions here. So we will return with questions later on. So we're turning to Dhanasree in India. You have been following India in climate diplomacy for many years, and also the geopolitical relations in the region and related to climate and energy. So I'm very happy to have you here online. But I would like to start to ask you a bit sort of general perhaps, but what is India's position on climate change issues and its role in climate diplomacy?
Thank you so much, Gunilla, for that question. And maybe I should start by saying that for India, climate diplomacy today ranges from multilateral to bilateral to minilateral to even triangular sort of relationships that India engages in when it comes to climate change related cooperation with other countries or international organizations or financial institutions, etc. So it's also interesting to note that India hosted the G20 presidency this year, wherein again climate change featured as a major area of cooperation among the G20 countries, but also beyond that. For instance, the African Union, for instance, became a part of the G20, which also means that there would be sort of greater consensus when it comes to talking about issues such as climate change. And within the G20 declaration, the Delhi declaration, clearly the focus was on renewable energy expansion, energy efficiency, and I think most importantly, climate finance. And I think this is something that India would be talking about at COP28. But beyond that, as I said, this is going to be the center point of India's climate diplomacy, at least for the coming years, because of the increasing demand for climate finance. Which is, as I said, not just for renewable energy expansion, which seems to be at the center of India's climate diplomacy when it comes to strategic partnerships, say with the United States, European Union, and other partners. But also, if you look at it, also India requires more adaptation finance. And I think this is where there is a huge gap. And I think that this idea of vulnerability hasn't really featured much in India's climate diplomacy, strangely, which is something, if you follow climate negotiations and how does India talk about vulnerability, and it's something that has come up only recently, particularly in relation to the loss and damage fund and loss and damage finance. And that's a very important shift that you could see, that India is demanding also more finance for losses and damages caused by climate change related events. So it is going to be a tough game to play for India, because it's obviously balancing between this image of the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, but at the same time, it constantly tries to drive home the point that India's per capita emissions continue to be very low. So, these are two sort of opposing standpoints when it comes to positioning India within the global climate debate. And on the other hand, as I said, it's also about balancing between adaptation and mitigation, because increasingly you see that India is tagging adaptation to its climate diplomacy positions, because earlier most of the positions were sort of, of course, adaptation was important, but it was largely kind of focused upon mitigation commitments and equity, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. These of course will continue to be part of India's positions, but it is also kind of moving in the direction of per capita plus. So that's something that you could see, especially in the past few years and maybe 10 years or so. You can see that the per capita plus, which is to say that, okay, per capita emissions may be low, but then, India also needs to adopt a low carbon development strategy and a long-term strategy, which is something that is integral now to its, partnerships with other countries. But, there are a whole lot of challenges which we can talk about. Yeah.
Very interesting. And if we look more specifically at this year's negotiations, COP28, what would you say that are the most important for India in these negotiations? So of course, they relate to what you said, but if we could sort of delve into that a bit, and also what could we expect from India in the negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main question is again going to be about climate finance. When I read official statements coming from the government and also looking at the debates that are currently going on within India, a lot of it is about long-term climate finance, also about the definition of climate finance, because so far we also don't have a universally acknowledged or universally defined sort of climate finance. So that's something that is also India is trying to focus on. There's also a question of grants versus loans debate, that a lot of climate finance is coming in the form of loans, and which is something that is adding to the debt stress or debt crisis within developing countries. So there's also this demand for more grants and additional finance, right? So I think that's very important for India. The other aspects, which is also interesting to note, especially with respect to the global stocktake, and this is where I also saw in Bonn, for instance, when the climate conference happened, there was a lot of discussion on equity in the IPCC models, and I think this also got some sort of momentum among the other developing countries, which sought clarification on this and maybe acknowledging this within the global stocktake report itself, that there is a need for integrating equity into IPCC models, and also equity and CBDR generally needs to be acknowledged more strongly within the global stocktake report. So that's, I think, one of the key demands as well. The language around fossil fuels is something it's not very clear where India stands, because India was obviously the a country that talked about including the language of phase down, of course not out, phase down of all fossil fuels, which includes coal, oil, and gas. But there seems to be not much discussion around it this time. We have to wait and see how where India would position itself. Maybe the same language, but then it would also be conditioned or maybe contingent on many other factors. The other part, which I think is going to be also important from an Indian perspective, is to continue to point out the difference between pre-2020 commitments, which were not met by the developed countries, or continue to be not met, and post-2020. So not to forget the pre-2020 completely when we are talking about future climate action. And I think this is something that will also be reiterated by the Indian delegation. Yeah.
Interesting. I think, I mean, now we talked a bit about phasing out fossil fuels, and Naghmeh also mentioned that. But I mean, if you look at scaling up renewable energy and phasing out fossil fuels, it's sort of two sides of the same coin. And I mean, India has, as you mentioned, played a central part in these discussions. And but where is, I mean, if you could elaborate a bit on India's stand here on the language, in particular on fossil fuels, and also the renewable energy goals.
Yeah, so India is it's also one of those countries which tends to under-promise and overachieve when it comes to renewable energy targets, and also the carbon intensity reduction targets. So it seems to be well on its path to achieve those targets, but it requires still more finance for renewable energy expansion. For instance, I haven't seen any figure that shows what are the costs of just transition that we are planning to put in place within the country. Again, there's a huge question mark over that. But when it comes to fossil fuels and renewable energy, the whole discussion, I mean, I think it's important to look at what's going on within the country. So as of now, it looks like the government is very keen on doubling coal production by 2030, because we continue to face power shortage every year. Even like right now, for instance, we are having long electricity shortages, even in the place where I live. So it means that there's going to be emphasis on doubling coal production, or maybe increasing at least coal production in the next few years. Now, this is obviously contradictory to some of the language that India has been talking about, especially in terms of phasing down of coal power, and the statement, the official statements from the Ministry of Coal and others, which clearly state that we cannot compromise on our energy requirements at this stage. So, there's obviously a dichotomous sort of position when it comes to fossil fuel phase down, or, versus the energy requirements itself. But at the same time, it says, for instance, the G20 declaration about doubling energy efficiency rate or tripling renewable energy. And in addition to that, like I mentioned, it also says that it will require $4 trillion per year climate finance for the clean energy, tech by 2030. So this means that a lot of these commitments or targets that India is setting for itself would also be contingent on external climate finance. Now that's very pertinent, because so far what we have seen in the figures is that, again, most of the climate finance that we have has been domestically generated. A lot of it from the government through budgetary spending, a lot of it from the public sector undertakings like public enterprises, less so from the private enterprises itself. So almost 90% of it come from domestic sources. So that's the reason as to what the government keeps saying, that this is the reason why we are not able to step up our act, that there's not enough external climate finance that is coming into India, and the requirements are just growing every year. But as I said, so this means that the language that India did talk about at Sharm el-Sheikh and what it is talking about right now, there seems to be a gap. But it will also depend on, I think geopolitically, it's also important for India to kind of align its positions with other G77 countries and most vulnerable countries. And we have to wait and see how that goes. But essentially, this is like, I think, the same kind of situation that we were in at the Paris summit, where again, there was a talk about doubling coal production. But domestically, this hasn't really fructified. So we have to wait and see how the doubling coal production rhetoric, which has been going on for more than a decade, hasn't really happened. So what is the domestic sort of momentum towards it?
Excellent, thank you, Dhanasree. I think this really provides some sort of insight in how India, a really important actor in the negotiations, and also what the future direction also would be for India. So thank you. We will now turn to not to China geographically, but to Finland and to Karoliina. You recently wrote a book, your PhD dissertation on China and climate leadership. Very interesting. So we will talk about China with you, and also starting with this bit general issue on how you would describe China's role in climate diplomacy.
Yes, and good morning. Sorry, I froze here the camera, but I hope you can hear me. So good morning on my behalf as well, and thank you for the invitation for this brilliant panel. So if I would describe China's role in climate diplomacy, so of course China's role includes many contradictions, and these contradictions also challenge how China's climate diplomacy is then understood, particularly from outside China. So due to China's increased capacity and its role as the world's greatest emitter in absolute terms, it makes China also one of the most, if not the most, important actor in the negotiations. So although China is still the greatest emitter this year, a lot has happened in China's role during the past 15 years. So if somebody would have mentioned, for example, in 2009 in Copenhagen, that within 10 years' time, China will have a carbon neutrality announcement, I think many of the observers would have had a hard time believing it to be true. So even though China's climate targets are not evaluated as very ambitious at the moment, there has still been progress or a development to a more constructive and ambitious direction. And then if we look at China's role within the coalitions at the UNFCCC, so China's role in climate diplomacy cannot really be discussed without the context of developing country group G77. So due to this old dichotomy of developed and developing countries, China is still negotiating as a developing country in the negotiations, and this solidarity for the global south plays an important role in China's climate diplomacy. So China has been constructing this role of a leader of the global south, and it has also been playing this role of a responsible great power. And due to these two roles, particularly, I see that the pressure coming from the more vulnerable nations, so small island developing states, African states, least developed states, should not be downplayed. So I think it is in China's interest not to be seen as an irresponsible actor from the perspective of these countries.
Thank you. I think, I mean, if we look at a bit of the incentives for China now to raise its ambitions, would you see that they are, I mean, it's more difficult political context and it's more like the political relations are more tense. Would China have less incentives to raise its climate ambitions in this particular context?
I would not necessarily say less incentives, but I think it, of course, depends on how the other actors will implement their pledges and what they will promise. So I think the answer depends on which context and timescale we're looking at China's ambition. So I mean, if we look at, for example, renewables, I think it's quite easy to argue that China is actually all the time increasing its climate ambition and on a rate that is really superior comparison to other actors. But then if we look at China's commitments and targets that it has set, I think my answer might be more pessimistic in this sense. So I think China has been quite rule-oriented in its climate diplomacy. So for example, considering the encouragement in Glasgow in 2021 that countries should submit their next round of nationally determined contributions earlier than was agreed in the Paris Agreement text. So China has sort of tended to ignore these kind of encouragements and reminded all parties that we should not renegotiate Paris Agreement, but sort of stick to those guidelines that we have agreed in Paris text. So therefore, I do not think, and I of course might be wrong, but I could imagine that there will not be any signs of early announcement of China's next NDC, which are to be submitted by 2025. So instead of the schedule of submitting these NDCs, I think the focus should more be the content of the NDC. So the next round of NDCs is the first time that China's commitment covers the era after it has promised to peak its emissions. And in this way, the next commitment is really globally important and significant, that China's emissions do not only peak, but that after the peak, there will not be only a plateau, but that the quality of the peak would be ambitious. So that in the next NDC, there would be this clear path showing how they will reach the carbon neutrality. Yes. Thanks.
If we zoom in on COP28, what would you say are the expectations on China in these negotiations this year?
Well, I think regarding COP28, we have to remember that this is the first conference actually for China after its strict zero COVID policies that ended only in January this year. So in Glasgow and in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, to some extent, China was accused of being more passive than before. And one of its responses to this criticism, for example, for having a smaller delegation or not having a pavilion in Glasgow, was that from China's perspective, the world was still in the middle of a pandemic. So I think this year we could perhaps then expect to have a larger delegation from China and to have more input in the side events and in the pavilion events. But if we look at the negotiating position, there have been many positive signs this November that China would arrive to the negotiations with a more perhaps constructive attitude. So China released its long-awaited methane action plan this November. And like Naghmeh mentioned, last week China and US released this Sunnyland statement on enhancing cooperation to address the climate crisis. And this statement reaffirmed their commitment to work jointly and together with other countries to address this crisis. And if you consider this timing of the COP, it's really, I think it is an important momentum for this US-China relationship, because a lot of this bilateral climate cooperation has been thanked for their special climate envoys, John Kerry and Xi Zhenhua. And regarding this relationship, there's rumors that Xi Zhenhua will retire after this COP, and considering the US elections next year. So I think this is a really one of the last chances to see how their bilateral cooperation regarding these two envoys could increase. Then if I can still continue, I don't know if I've been talking too long, but just the more agenda issues that Naghmeh already mentioned about loss and damage. So these are, of course, really difficult questions for China. And China has been supporting the G77 stance on these issues. So like was mentioned before, the World Bank as a host and developing countries' access to the funding. And also the phase down, phase out question will be very difficult for China. I see few items that might be more easy to get China to agree on, and they're the renewable energy capacity, tripling that capacity, and then peaking global emissions by 2030, because these issues are then, of course, closer to China's own current commitments.
Thank you. I was the deal you were referring to between US and China. It was earlier in November, where these two countries committed to a series of actions to limit climate pollution. Would that also, I mean, if you could elaborate a bit on, would that have an impact on the COP28? I was thinking of, I mean, the comparison here would be the 2014, when you had a bilateral agreement between US and China, which sort of, to a certain extent at least, paved the way for the Paris Agreement. Would this have the same effect, you think?
Yes, well, this Sunnyland statement, it builds on the Glasgow Joint Declaration in 2021. And it is, of course, in line also with this broader goal of sort of trying to stabilize their bilateral relationship. So I see maybe the key difference to the 2014 statements is that they were more, maybe perhaps more targeted towards the COP. So there were, for example, more detailed sort of agenda setting efforts, and also more perhaps there were goals set by China individually and goals set by US individually. So this statement was seen more as a sort of a bilateral statement rather than as a statement to set agenda for COP28. Although having said this, it of course builds some encouragement that these two great emissions can have this dialogue again. So in this sense, it is a positive sign, of course. What I see is a really important part of this declaration for COP28, particularly, is that it's the first time that China has announced that its next NDC will be economy-wide, meaning that it will cover all sectors and that it will include all greenhouse gases. So it's not only covering carbon dioxide, which the previous commitments by China have mostly focused on. And there is also this phrase that they encourage others to move on these economy-wide NDCs. So I think this is an important message for other emerging nations, that China is willing to move to this sort of a broader NDC, and hopefully then others would follow a similar path.
Thank you so much, Karoliina. It's really great to get these this view or perspectives from China, from China. So thank you for providing that. We will turn back to the studio and to Stacy, and you've been working for a very long time on the US, North America, environmental governance, but also Europe, EU, and climate leadership. So we're very happy to have you here to share your knowledge. So I was thinking that we could focus on the US, but we will slide into China and the EU as well. So let's start with the leadership question. I think I mean, if you're looking at it, which state or states do you think have the capacity and appetite for leadership in these climate negotiations at COP28?
Yeah, that's a great question. As Naghmeh indicated, the agenda is huge at these annual COPs, and very complex. So I think what you see is that while the United States always has an absolutely immense delegation going to all kinds of meetings everywhere, all over the place at these summits, it's clearly the case that the Biden administration wants to play leadership roles in some places and is much less interested or is cautious about others. So you see this kind of this complex agenda play out in the sense that no one actor is, a particularly reliable leader anywhere, even if it regards itself as having a leadership role. So for the U.S., I think one of the clear priorities is to lead in terms of leadership is brokering some of these incremental improvements in the emissions reduction goals for major emitters, especially China. So I think it's very clear that the Biden administration sees itself as the kind of lead negotiator with China on a lot of these questions in the world. And I think you see that it's very clear that the US is most reluctant on the loss, damage, compensation, liability cluster of financial, of essentially primarily it has financial concerns about these things, right? So you see there that while the administration wants to play a leadership role on a whole bunch of energy questions, it's largely on defense and not wanting to be out front on loss and damage or on liability and compensation. And I think the other thing that's always fascinating is that we often focus on these big countries, but one of the kind of reliable set of leaders are the small island states who have been well organized in climate meetings for many years, and they bring together the stories of vulnerability and the stories of the need for adaptation and in particular the story of injustice. They did not emit all of these gases that are causing the climate to change, but they are suffering pretty catastrophic consequences already, and those are likely to get worse. So you see them, well organized and present all over the place, and I think they have played a very important role often in reminding. Sort of in terms of the language and in terms of the imagery, what's at stake.
Yeah, very interesting, and I agree of this. But I was just thinking, is there a short follow-up on that? Is it less traction for that leadership narrative from the small island states in the current political context, would you say?
Yeah, I think that might be right. Because I think as Naghmeh indicated, the most challenging parts of the agenda, I think, are around these loss, damage, and adaptation financing questions. That there are virtually every item on the agenda has different interests and different stakeholders and phrases and words at stake in the negotiations. But you see the distance between the parties is the largest around these issues, and indeed it's probably the area of the most distance between the American and the European position as well. So it's not just a north-south difference, but that's this financial piece on loss and damage and the language about liability, compensation, adaptation finance. These are all places where the EU and Washington are farther apart.
But yeah, I think that's also, I mean, the difference between the EU and the US when it comes to leadership. It's always been back and forth a bit. The EU, as Niklas will talk about, but it has sort of framed itself as leader for many years. But and you mentioned some of the differences, but could you delve into that a bit? What are the different approaches between those actors? Sure.
I think one thing to say is that while there have always been differences across the Atlantic on these issues, one of the other things, though, is that there is a lot more similarity than we often talk about. So in terms, when you sort of dig into both the official positions, but also the set of policies and instruments at play in Europe and in the US, the fact that some EU member states have overcomplied and, and are sort of aggressively leading these sets of issues, and others have struggled to keep up, is the same among US states who get, high levels of difference. So, I mean, in terms of a lot of the political dynamics, the policies enacted and such, you see often more similarity than we see. Europe's leadership role was often much earlier and is more long-lasting, and it's been more consistent. As you know, the American role has varied with the varying interest or hostility of the occupants of the White House. But I think on the differences, this, as I mentioned, the U.S. has been the most reluctant on loss and damage, and compared to the European Union. And the United States is much more likely to talk about all of the other ways to raise money besides the money from the American taxpayers. Essentially, that's the phrase that you often hear in Washington: less money from the American taxpayers. Excuse me. And so you see here that when the Europeans are trying to work on more concrete pledges, higher numbers, deadlines, and goals, the American position is often more vague, supportive in general, often wants to talk more about the contributions of the private sector, the contributions of UN partnership programs, thinking about how to, the American delegation won't use the word double count, but they'd be very happy to count things that are in the SDG commitments and all over the agenda, sort of the so-called greening of our aspects of bank finance. So you see that here they're quite a ways apart. And I think Naghmeh is exactly right that we don't know the phrases and the language yet that will come out on the other side of the meetings when they're done in December, precisely because you get this key difference. I think also the United States has often played the role of its delegation has often been more aggressive in its language about commitments by developing countries, and the European Union has tended to want to be moderately supportive of the American position, but not be out front demanding that countries in the global South, particularly the larger ones with higher levels of economic growth, do more sooner. This kind of, so you get some differences there as well in terms of priorities. Helpful? Yeah, absolutely. It's really really interesting. I mean, if you've been following climate negotiations for many years, you could see these shifts that are very interesting with these sectors. But if we turn to COP28, and what do you say are the most important issues for the US in these negotiations? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, first, it's a relatively nice change in some respects that the Biden administration has, in a way, more credibility than the American delegation usually has when it shows up at these meetings, because they have, in fact, managed to enact some reasonably substantial energy transition goals and other kinds of climate policies. So I think one difference is that they're not just serious about their analysis and the negotiating positions, but they, I think, feel like they have a record to stand on that is unusual if we look back at previous administrations, irrespective of parties. So from there, their priorities are certainly the priority has been to rebuild bilateral cooperation with China in the UNFCCC context. So I think you see that's a priority. Lots of partnerships, lots of organizing. The American delegation and administrations are organizing as many announcements by corporations and other things as you can. The Biden administration also is very keen to talk more and make stronger commitments on methane, because it's a domestic priority at home for them, and they have some regulatory instruments, in process at home. And here in particular, because methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas, they also, in a way, like the math of their focus on the methane, because they think it is one of the places where, because we are, as you mentioned, late and running out of time, it's one of the things that the analysis show. If methane emissions could really be brought down fairly substantially over the next 5 to 10 years, you get a real gain there in terms of overall emissions. And then I think the administration has become fairly enthusiastic about this idea of the goal of tripling renewable energy capacity globally by 2030, by the doubling of energy efficiency targets. My view would be that the tripling of energy efficiency is a really important and doable goal, and probably can be, measured and given in language that's accountable. I think the much harder for energy efficiency, it's not at all clear that there are lots of history of targets on energy efficiency, and there's not as much history of meeting them. So I think that's something to watch there.
Yeah, a lot of interesting issues to watch and keep track on. I would also like the question that I posed to Karoliina on the US-China deal, what it means for COP28. I'm also thinking of, some years ago, we could say that environment or climate could be like an issue that sort of could less tension in the international system. I'm not sure if that's the case here, but perhaps you want to your perspective on that.
I think that's right. I think it's important. It's an important signal, as I mentioned, in part because the US and China make up together almost 40% of global emissions. So we speak about a gigantic amount of global emissions. And the American emissions are on a downward trajectory, but that downward, since 2005, but that downward trajectory has been very slow and uneven, and in the last couple of years, it's ticked back up a little bit. So it's quite important, it seems to me, that the two of them work together. US-China relations in general are quite tense and not very good. So in some respects, it's a great signal in the run-up to the COP this November statement, precisely because they managed to do a November statement, which I think earlier in the year was very much in doubt. And it does include a number of things the statement includes a number of directions that China has been moving on its own for a while. This making a methane commitment, making commitments about all non-carbon gases. There are a set of actions in sort of action pledges in the statement about technically collaborating in terms of building some sets of committees. So if this collaboration can be maintained, whether it's on energy efficiency or methane or on plastics, there's a little signal there that they're going to try to work together on the global plastics agenda as well, which I thought was important. All of those things are really important if they can be institutionalized into collaboration that's real. So if they signal that the next 2 or 3 years can have more robust collaboration, and during the global stocktake process, and sort of turning up the goals, that's great. But so I think it matters that it happened. I will also say I think it's in some respects evidence that these global meetings matter, because the reason the statement happened in November is because both countries have an incentive to get something done and to give the world a signal that they're working on it before they show up at the COP. So I think sometimes it's easy to criticize these big meetings where lots of people fly to them, and the sort of kind of rhetoric about that and they are, in fact, they sometimes disappoint us. But I think this kind of thing is evidence. It's an annual deadline, and if you want to show up as the United States or China and say that you're serious, then they needed to do this statement that they did. It would have been nice if it had indeed, for those of us who want more aggressive action, it would have been nice if it had included more aggressive numbers. It didn't, but I don't think that was particularly surprising considering where they had been over the last year and a half.
That is very true. I mean, it's also the forum that we have that is totally inclusive as well. So, so thank you so much for these valuable insights on the US and a bit broader as well. So thank you. We'll get back to with questions, I'm sure. Turning to Niklas, and you've been studying European politics, EU diplomacy, climate security for a long time as well. So I'm happy to have you here and discuss the European Union. What expectations are there at the EU at COP28, would you say?
Thank you, Gunilla. I'm also happy to be here, obviously, with all of you. This has been a great discussion, I think, up until this point. Hopefully, I can contribute to something to the table here. I mean, so what are kind of the EU hoping to achieve at the COP? And I think something that Stacy mentioned before, that the kind of the EU's position towards the COP and the kind of the climate negotiation has been pretty consistent. It has been one of the players that has been, so to speak, most committed to make the Paris Agreement work and have this as a main venue for reaching international and kind of global commitment. So that, I think that is something that is important to kind of take into account when we look at the EU. Then, of course, we can come back to the question of whether the EU is still kind of, you know, in a leadership position and how that has changed in a changing geopolitical context. And of course, I think also we haven't mentioned that, up until this point, but of course, this year's COP takes place in a region that is heavily affected by a war. Of course, we have Israel's war against Hamas, and there is some kind of an uncertainty around, of course, the whole event and the whole kind of venue that I think that we also need to somehow kind of be aware of, even though I don't think that anyone is maybe expecting that they will need to cancel the meeting. So, but then coming back to what the EU has been signaling, if you look at what they were able to agree on in ahead of the meeting, the Council of the EU, and that's maybe something also for the people listening, like the kind of the EU climate diplomacy starts at home. It's important to kind of acknowledge that, right? But the EU can kind of bring to the table as the EU depends on what the member states can agree on, and that's basically also there's a parallel maybe to what Stacy has mentioned, that since there is this kind of annual rhythm to the COPs, you have the kind of the EU system responding to that, and you have member states coming together to negotiate the negotiating mandate ahead of COP. So if you look at what the member states were able to agree on back in October, it is very clear that the EU is committed to something that we have heard both Naghmeh, Stacy, and others already talking about, the kind of the renewable energy kind of aspect of the negotiations of the package here, something that the EU has been very much kind of focusing on and wanting to contribute to. Also, if you look at what the EU is signaling before COP, their heavy emphasis on energy efficiency, something that they want to see action on and want to contribute to. Now, another thing that Stacy mentioned and that you have seen movement on from the EU side is when it comes to loss and damage, and the kind of top negotiators from the EU has been lining up with the shares for this year's COP, the United Arab Emirates, to kind of signal that they want to have something ambitious outcome when it comes to the loss and damage fund. This was a controversial issue coming out of the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, where I remember talking to EU diplomats, EU officials, and they described that they were kind of a little bit taken aback by the fierce kind of language that a lot of developmental countries were directing against the EU at that point, where the EU was saying, maybe we don't need a new fund. There are already funding here. We maybe need to kind of just direct it better and think about mechanism to kind of tap into that. Whereas that was, not going down well, and the EU the EU was kind of seen as, denying developing countries funding or not wanting to play on a loss and damage fund. So there has been a lot of kind of discussion and I think diplomatic footwork around that from the EU side to say that, look, we're not against this. We want to have something ambitious in terms of loss and damage also coming out of COP28. So I think that's something that we can kind of look forward. Then, I mean, I'm agreeing with everyone else, right? That we don't. There is so much kind of contestation also around these issues, so it's hard to see at this point what the negotiating outcome is going to be, right? But I think that's something that the EU is signaling and ahead of the negotiations that they are committed to. Yeah.
I would also like to hear your viewpoint on, I mean, some of the more specific recent developments within the EU, or mainly within the EU. Like there's some really positive policy developments. You have this Fit for 55, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for instance, on the one hand, but you also have, on the other hand, some people are talking about the EU backlash. You have more conservative politicians that are sort of attacking green policies, in particular in front of the upcoming European Parliament elections in May, right?
Right.
So where are the EU here, and like would it be difficult to EU to sort of pursue the negotiating agenda in light of these developments?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think it really kind of hits hard at what is maybe the increased problem that the EU is facing in terms of how it's trying to present its leadership and how it tries to kind of do its climate diplomacy. So if we kind of take so there's basically two questions, right? So what is it that kind of makes the EU somehow unique, and what is it that it has going forward, so to speak, and what is the kind of the political situation we're in now in Europe? So if we start with the first question, I think it's important to say that it goes back to what Stacy and maybe others were saying, that the EU for a long time has a model that it wants to kind of also show to the rest of the world, right? That there are kind of policy solutions that we can do at home that is going to affect European emissions, and they can serve as an inspiration for others, right? So you've had the European emission trading systems in place for a long time. You can argue whether it's efficient enough, or if there's too many credits in the system, it has to be reduced and all that. If it does what it should, but at least there is that model, right? And you have, as you said, the whole kind of what we usually call or refer to as the European Green Deal, that has now kind of been implemented into law on an EU level. You have the European climate law, you have the whole Fit for 55 package, the whole idea that the EU can reduce its emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to the 1990 baseline and all that stuff. So that it is there, right? But on the other hand, there has been a discussion whether there is, whether this idea that the EU is a model as a consequence of what it is able to agree on internally, and whether that is a model for others to follow, or whether the EU, there is some kind of a vulnerability to the EU model because it's so focused on regulation. That was an interesting critique I think we've heard before the whole discussion on backlash, and we'll get back to that. But before, because when Biden came into office and you saw what the US could do with the Inflation Reduction Act, basically have a different approach to how you can kind of leverage policies to promote climate goals, whether it's investment or tax cuts or whatever it is, much more kind of forward-leaning climate policies. Then, of course, there was this discussion whether the EU's focus on regulation and try to kind of get this kind of level playing field in terms of regulations is not maybe doing the trick in a sense. So there was that critique back in the days. And then, of course, we had the discussion on what you were referring to as the carbon, the CBAM, or the carbon border adjustment mechanism, as another tool to make the kind of the EU's model work, in a sense. If you have an ambition in the EU to reduce emissions and make a lot of the European economy industry greener, and then if you don't address the issue of carbon leakage by importing products such as steel or fertilizer or cement outside of the EU, and those producers are not kind of living up to the same standard as the European producers, you're going to have a problem of competition, but also not meeting climate emissions and goals. So that's the whole idea of CBAM. But it has been perceived by many, at least the developing countries, but also others, countries like an disguised form of European protectionism. Again, so that's again comes back to the whole discussion that a lot of what the EU is doing at home is tied to its climate diplomacy efforts and trying to kind of build momentum, outreach, and buy-in from other partners to kind of follow its lead and maybe to kind of learn from the European experience as European climate diplomats try to want to portray it as. So I think that's, but there is that, and the CBAM, just specifically on that topic, it has entered what they call the kind of the transition phase now, and we're basically in a period where we're going to see whether it can work or it will work as intended in terms of how to make it effective as a tool to kind of track products that comes into the EU. But maybe we can come back to that as well. And then to your other question on the backlash, and I think this is a major thing, right? I mean, we just saw the elections in the Netherlands just now, Geert Wilders being the winner, even though of course he will need to negotiate like all Dutch politicians. They will have to spend a lot of time stitching together a kind of a coalition to actually have a government in place. But he is set in a position where he will be a major player, right, in the next Dutch government. And I mean, before the election, some of us were kind of thinking that maybe Frans Timmermans, the previous EU commissioner and kind of responsible for the Green Deal, would be in that position because he stepped down to head the Social Democrats in the Dutch elections. But that does not seem to be the case, maybe. So that what we're seeing in the Netherlands is, I think, part of a much broader agenda or broader trend in the EU, where a lot of countries are moving to the right, and right-wing politicians, even extreme right or populist rights parties, are getting more and more of an influence on domestic politics. And you see across the board in many countries that the issue of climate has become politicized, that a lot of from the extreme right and the populist right are using climate to signal to voters and others that we're not the progressive left, we're not buying into this agenda. We can't support this cumbersome, costly, non-effective climate policies that the European Union is forcing upon us. We can't save the world alone. China and the US will have to do much more. It's time for the EU to do something else. So I think that the narrative, you see that in many countries. So definitely in Spain, even though the right and the far right did not manage to get into a government in Spain, and we will have a left-leaning government instead that typically is kind of pro-climate, so to speak, and is having a much more ambitious climate agenda going forward. So that is a big thing to look out for. And as you say, we have the European elections coming up next year, and depending on how the European Parliament is going to look after that election, we will have to look out for who are going to be heading the Commission again. If it's not going to be Ursula von der Leyen, who is going to be, right? And of course, also if we have a bunch of member states that are very less ambitious when it comes to climate policies. The makeup of the commissions, the persons that are going to end up in the commission can be very different from what we have seen now under the conditions that made the European Green Deal possible. So there is definitely a lot of discussion on that, and this is something that we definitely need to look out for.
Thank you, Niklas. And this is, I mean, it's a very complex actor in that sense. You have these different levels it works from, but it was really good insights, also things to watch out for. Now we have reached to the point where we have talked to all panelists and got all these great views from you, so thank you. So now I will turn to questions, and we have some questions here from the audience, but first I would like to tie into the discussions we have had here on elections. And I think if we look at, there's basically around a quarter of the world's population is facing elections in the upcoming year. So it's the EU, as we talked about, I think also India, Indonesia, Russia, and perhaps UK, Pakistan, amongst others. So, and we see in many of those countries, we see the risk of populism and the rise of populism or the backlash. We talked about that. And I would just like to open up for you in the panel to, if you have any thoughts on this, what will happen with the Paris Agreement? Is it possible to have strong climate action in this? Where would the action actually happen? Who will become a leader in this? A complex question, but it's just very, since we had this knowledge panel, I would love to have this discussion. So anyone who would like to start?
I mean, I'll start and just say that, yeah, I mean, the climate stakes in the American election next year will be very high, of course, because we have two major parties and only one of them really wants both domestic and global climate action. I think one of the things that's changed in American politics over the last few years is that the Democratic candidate and the Democratic Party will run much more strongly as pro-climate than it traditionally had. It had been regarded as the party you vote for if you have environmental concerns for a long time. But I think it has until the last election, just the previous Biden election, climate and environment had not taken a center place in American presidential elections, or had on the set of major issues that the party ran on until this last time. And I would expect Biden to do so again. It's considered one of the reasons, the ways that Democrats are trying to get younger voters in particular. And so I would see it there. I'm fascinated with the backlash discussions as well, because of course backlash is a common theme of American politics for some time, but it definitely has shown up on this side of the Atlantic.
Right.
I think one of the interesting things that will be very fascinating to see with the European elections is whether or not left parties and green parties run relatively aggressively against their own governments in places like the Netherlands and indeed in Sweden, in order to try to do better in the elections, the European elections, than they did in the previous national elections, right? So, I mean, I think sometimes we have seen that pattern around, and so it'll be fascinating to see both what are the overall makeup of the parliament, but also where different candidates for to be an MP really focus on this and where they do not in Europe. I think it's going to be an adventure to watch.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Niklas, would you like to?
Yeah, no, I'm just agreeing with Stacy, and I'm thinking that it is. I mean, it is unfortunate, but I think it's very clear, right, that kind of the climate issue has become linked to, and some so-called progressive agenda. So, right, so if you will walk into a room and just talk to people and say, you know, you know, where do you stand on LGBT rights, or, you know, how do you see cultural issues, or what kind of food do you eat? I mean, all these things come together, and that is, you know, it's making the kind of cross coalition or kind of broader action that is needed to address many of these complex issues harder, I guess, at least from the kind of the political rhetoric point of view, in a sense that these things that now seems to kind of cluster together so much. Obviously, of course, political entrepreneurs are definitely jumping on this and seeing this as a possibility, right, to promote their kind of positions ahead of elections and all that. So I think that's definitely complicated. But then on the other hand, I think there has been interesting stuff brought up in our discussions here, that there are movements, you know, in countries. China is a very interesting actor here, and maybe Karoliina wants to kind of come back to that. But that observation that China seems to kind of under pledge but overperform and that kind of stuff, and also movements when it comes to the big issue here, of course, in all climate discussion on energy and how fast we can kind of move on renewables rather than fossils is something that might also, when these things starts to maybe, you know, hit home in also in European countries but others, maybe this dynamic, this intense politicization around the climate issue might kind of, we can kind of move beyond it. But in the current state that we're in now, it looks very difficult to kind of break out of this equilibrium where climate is now seen as only a progressive issue.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any perspectives from India or China on this? It's a bit different, obviously, but still.
I mean, I don't think climate change has ever been a major issue in the election cycle in India, to be honest, and I don't think it will be in the next election either. Because because of various reasons. Of course, you know, I think as of now, like I said, there are many other issues that are under, you know, that are being focused upon more by central government, state governments, and other governments. So we also have to remember the political or governance landscape in India, wherein most of the climate action, although the pledges are probably being made by the government at the center, a lot of these are implemented at the state level. So at the state level, obviously, there are varied, climate vulnerabilities that may be like some states are more cyclone prone, some states face a lot of flooding issues. The Himalayan states have their own vulnerabilities. Some states are way ahead in terms of renewable energy development and deployment. So there are varied priorities. And so in that sense, I don't see climate change as a major issue in the elections, in the upcoming elections. Of course, the youth seems to be recognizing climate change as an important issue. Recent surveys have also shown that. But I think it's also like the youth, the progressive, so, like it was mentioned earlier, it's like these progressive, maybe urban youth who seem to be more keen on this than others, because for most of the communities in India, it's mostly about electricity shortage, or it is about unemployment. It's about all these issues which are a bigger priority. So that's why even when the Fridays for Future movement took or developed sort of within India, it was mostly seen as this urban movement and not something that has really become so widespread across the country, which is the reality. It's like hardly, very less proportion of the youth has been part of such environmental movements. But there is a huge socio-ecological movements, which, as I said, it's combined with social issues. It's never really ecological or climate alone. It's always sort of intertwined with the social issues, which has been there in grassroots level and which are being dealt with at a very different level, which does not really, it doesn't really get represented well enough in the political landscape itself. And that's something that is very important to understand. So there is action, there is demand for action as well, especially with the growing climate vulnerabilities. I see that the states in particular are coming up with, more, action plans, revised action plans. Some of them have come up with, revised action plans on climate change recently. But these are, as I said, these are also, so we have political, we have governments with different political parties at the state level. So, that also needs to be accounted for. So we have a center, the central government, which is one party. We may have other parties at the state level who may have, sometimes a different agenda as well. But as I said, these are mostly kind of responses to what are the demands on the ground, and also, I think importantly tapping into the climate investments itself, which is very important for many states if they, have to implement the state action plans on climate change, which is a very important node of climate action in India. Yeah.
Oh yes, great perspective. Thank you. I don't know, Karoliina, if you have anything to add, would like to add something?
Yeah, maybe just to comment the under promise and overachieve point of China. So when it comes to climate leadership, I'm not sure if I mentioned this already, but China has been arguing for this shared type of climate leadership or collective leadership, not seeing it as a hegemony. And this does not, of course, mean that there would not be competition. So I see it in a way that in the next round of NDCs, China is very much looking, although it argues that it's not pressured by other states and its climate diplomacy is based on its own interests, of course, it is looking at these signals coming from the EU and US. And if there is no sort of this competition, if, for example, there's no strong signals that China's leadership position in renewables would be anyway jeopardized, there is, of course, less of a leverage to China than to increase its ambition. So I see it as a sort of, if the focus is, as it will be probably a lot on the election, so of course the focus on the next round of NDCs might look different.
Yes, thank you. We have got some questions here that I would like to continue with. The first one, I think it might be directed more to you, Naghmeh, but feel free to chip in, and the rest of the panel, of course. It's related to the discussion we just have about like the possibilities of COP meetings. So is it possible to create a political space outside the negotiations or somewhere else that is needed to drive climate ambition? So I guess it's a question related to like what happens outside the COP meetings. Are there other processes that are important, and how could they take part?
Good question. So the COPs, as you said, they're the most inclusive forum for addressing climate change. But because of the consensus rule, it's very difficult to get ambitious outcomes. So there have been ideas that more ambitious countries should form clubs outside the UNFCCC and drive change through setting examples, working together, making it more attractive to take action on climate change. So actually at COP28, this climate club type of proposal is going to be put forward. It's been negotiated through the G7, so the 7 largest industrialized countries, and they've invited other countries to join. So at the moment, I think they have about 24 countries that have agreed to be part of this climate club. But the sort of decision making in that club is also through consensus, as I've understood it. And many of these countries, like the US, are facing elections, and so it will be interesting to see whether that idea could work in practice. So also on the sort of power balances, there have been suggestions that they could be even more inclusive arenas. So about 10 years ago, there was an attempt by civil society to have a summit where there was more critical stances and more participation by marginalized voices. And that also brought up more pressure on countries to act. But of course, if you're not including the countries that need to act, then the sort of influence can be weak. So there is a lot going on, even outside the UNFCCC, but the COPs remain the key arena for these negotiations.
Yes, thank you. Any other one want to?
I would just say I think there's been some increased attention over the last few years on mayors and and provincial governments. It's not exactly a kind of authoritative space in terms of their work together, but it does offer a political space where political leaders at other levels of government who want to be seen as doing something on climate use the COP, in other words, to show that. So let's see, there's a long tradition. Governors of California are almost always make an appearance, for example, right? And so that's a kind of illustration of big city mayors and others who want to run at home as leading on this issue. It offers them a kind of platform, at least to do that.
I think you just offered me a perfect intro to the next question. It's what do you think the role of civil society and major groups will be during COP28? So it's an open question, I think, to one who wants to take a stab at it.
So the COP organizers are expecting 70,000 plus people to attend, even though quite a few civil society organizations are boycotting the COP because of where it is. So there will be a big presence of these major groups. So they also include indigenous peoples, business and industry, research and academics, and NGOs of all sorts. They have been promised that they will be included. There will be dialogue. There will be room for participation. But what we've seen is that when the negotiations get very tense, they tend to be closed down so that observers cannot attend. So we'll see how the COP organizers organize this year.
Absolutely.
I sometimes think they lurk as a shadow. Right. So I think state leaders know that the civil society groups at home will have something to say about what they say, internationally. But that's not nearly as direct of an influence at the COP as states have, certainly.
How about the civil society in India? What is it, the outlook?
So the civil society organizations in India, I mean, they are a little divided about how to position themselves on climate change, particularly when it comes to negotiations. They have a different policy domestically, but when they look at the negotiation space, then, I think it's more or less like a united stance as to what position should India take, not compromise on its development imperatives. Keep talking about climate justice, global south, global north divide as to why global north countries need to step up their ambition before demanding more action from countries like India. So that's been the general position, and it hasn't changed. I don't see much of a change in that from the civil society organizations in India with respect to negotiations or COP processes. But domestically, we are seeing a lot of, we are seeing a lot of opposition by civil society organizations, environmental NGOs against many regulations brought out by the government, by the central government in particular, especially the recent spate of many laws that were actually made more lax when it comes to infrastructure development, forest regulations being diluted. The environmental impact assessment rules again being diluted. So there are even in favor of some of these large-scale renewable energy projects that have actually excluded communities, have led to land grabs and many other issues. So climate action itself has led to many problems at the community level, which is why, as I said, the environmental NGOs in India, they try to bring together social, economic, and environmental issues. I mean, wouldn't say the sustainable development agenda, but more or less like, trying to bring these issues together to see how, communities and, or ecosystems can be protected, at the same time. So I think largely, as I said, there is a divide. And when it comes to the international level policy making, it is more or less, not to commit to climate action unless there's more action from the global north. And when it comes to actions within India, there has been a lot of criticism, and yeah, there is obviously demand for more, climate adaptation. Particularly, I think there's more emphasis on adaptation. That why are we not spending enough money on adaptation? There is not enough financing for adaptation, which is something that is being raised by the civil society organizations in India.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much for contributing to this very interesting discussion. And I think we all look forward to follow the negotiations that will start on Thursday next week, see what happens. And then we will base this on the knowledge we received here. So thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.